What is consciousness? Do you perceive the color red the same way that I do on the inside? What is wrong with the standard textbook version of vision? Why do you have so many feedback loops in the brain? And what does any of this have to do with Ernest Hemingway or Plato's cave or artificial neural networks that see dogs everywhere? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and author at Stanford, and in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Today's episode is about the sense of being alive. And in a moment, I'm going to bring in my colleague, Anil Seth, who wrote a great book called Being You, which is all about this neuroscientific problem. Now, by way of setting the table for this, you may say, what is the neuroscientific problem of consciousness? Well, it's simply this. It feels like something to be you. And that feeling flickers to life when you wake up in the morning. And it's not there when you're in a deep sleep or under anesthesia. And we're not sure how that happens. Our brains are made up of tens of billions of very sophisticated processing units, neurons, that are all operating together in a giant network. But just because something has a lot of pieces and parts doesn't tell you anything about why it's conscious, why there's any subjective experience. If you get the right tools and take your cover off your iPhone, you'll find that it has a chip which has 19 billion transistors. Now, just think about the interactions and the almost speed of light signaling in that rich, sweeping electronic landscape. But we don't have any meaningful reason to believe that your phone has consciousness or that it would be like something to be a phone. In other words, when your phone plays a funny video on the screen, do you think it feels amused? Or is it more likely that it's zeros and ones moving around in a deterministic way through these billions of pathways? When it gets an email from your boss, does it feel stressed? When it registers the receipt of a text message, does your phone have the capacity to feel sad? Probably not. But how do we make a more rigorous assessment of the question? How could we know what is conscious and what is not until we have tighter constraints on what consciousness is? This is the problem that neuroscience faces. How is it that all our billions of cells hook up in just such a way that we have consciousness? In other words, it feels like something to be us. Now, not so long ago in neuroscience, like 30 years ago, this problem of subjective experience was essentially not talked about. People generally felt it was too squishy, and they talked about how the brain worked, but not about why we have subjective experience. But things started to change around the 1990s when some great minds started devoting themselves to taking this problem seriously. And two of those minds happened to be Nobel laureates in San Diego. One was Francis Crick and one was Gerald Edelman, and they worked in neighboring institutions. And it happened that when I was a young postdoc, I got to work with Crick, and just across the way was another young postdoc working with Edelman. His name was Anil Seth, and we both were reared in this environment where it made sense to tackle the problem of subjective experience. The mission was, how can we work towards a scientific understanding of what consciousness is and how brains give rise to it? Anil Seth is now a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex, where he also directs the Sussex Center for Consciousness Science. In 2017, he gave a very popular TED Talk called Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality. And in 2021, he published a book called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. So I called him up to share his views on perception, consciousness, and reality. Here's my interview with Anil Seth.
What is consciousness? Well, of course, we could, you and I have discussed this for many, many hours, and philosophers for centuries. And so you've got to be pragmatic. And I define consciousness. I follow this philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who I think put it very beautifully and very simply. And his idea was that for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something to be me, and it feels like something to be you. It's a bit circular, right? There's experiencing happening. But I think there's something useful about that, because it doesn't mix up consciousness with other things like intelligence or language or a particular sense of identity. It's just any kind of experience whatsoever. So at least we know what we're talking about. It's also what goes away under something like general anesthesia and then comes back. That for me is a nice starting point for what consciousness is. So we know roughly what we're talking about. And then the approach is, well, how do we explain it in terms of neuroscience, biology, physics, whatever? How does it happen? Why is it the way it is? And here, my approach has been, again, quite pragmatic. Instead of trying to find some sort of magic eureka solution that magics conscious experience out of neurons or atoms or quantum fields or whatever it might be, let's just take a different approach and accept that consciousness exists, because there'll be some philosophers that try and tell you it doesn't even really exist, and that it has certain properties. Different experiences feel different ways, and emotion feels different from a visual experience. So let's try to understand how and why these experiences are the way they are. And every experience has various things in common too. Like every experience is unified more than the sum of its many parts. So my approach is to try to find ways of bridging between description of the brain, in some way, collection of neurons or areas or whatever, and descriptions of experience. And this is where this idea of controlled hallucination comes in. And I'm sure we'll dig more into it, but very, very simply, the idea is that instead of our experience of the world and the body sort of pouring itself into the brain through the transparent windows of the senses, in fact, perception works the other way around. It's not a new idea, it's very old, that perception is a process of inference. The brain is locked inside this bony vault of a skull. It's dark and silent in there. And so it has to make sense of sensory signals which don't have colors or shapes or labels. And they're uncertain, they're ambiguous and noisy with respect to whatever's going on in the world or in the body. So the brain's always casting out predictions about the causes of its sensory signals and using sensory signals to calibrate, to update these predictions. And the claim here is that's what we experience. The brain doesn't read out the world from the outside in. It's always actively constructing the world from the top down or the inside out. This is why I think the term controlled hallucination is useful, because we tend to think of hallucinations as things that are internally generated. And I think that's true for all our experiences. It's just that our normal perceptual experiences are controlled by, calibrated by, yoked to, geared to the world and the body in ways that are useful. So perception is a controlled hallucination and consciousness is a collection of perceptions.
So let's double click on a couple things there. So first, let's go back to the history, let's say Kant and Helmholtz, and think about what were the first clues that people got in thinking about this idea that we're not seeing reality as it is out there, but instead it's something of a construction.
I think you're right. The history of this is super fascinating, and it's, I think, not given enough credit sometimes. I mean, you can go right back to Plato, I think, in his allegory of the cave, where you have all these prisoners in a cave, they're chained to the walls, and all they can see are shadows cast on the wall of the cave by the light of a fire. And they take the shadows to be real because that's all they have access to. And they don't really know that there's anything out there that's, that is actually responsible for the shadows. So I think that's a great starting point, because our brain is in a bit of a similar situation to the prisoners in the cave. The brain doesn't have any direct access to anything, really, the body, the world, whatever. So it has to make its best guess of what's going on the basis of things like shadows. And then Kant, I think, for me, is always the reference point. I always keep coming back to his idea of the noumenon. So there is a reality. I'm often sometimes misunderstood as denying that there's a real world because I've used this word hallucination. But no, not at all. There is a real world. I think there is objective reality. At least to answer that question, you better ask a physicist rather than me. But the world that we experience is never identical to that world. It's always an interpretation. In Kant's way of thinking, the noumenon, reality as it really is always hidden behind a sensory veil or a kind of inferential curtain, as I might describe it now. And then, there were many hints. I think initially in vision, I think most of the early work in this was done by vision. There's Ibn al-Haytham, the Arabian scientist and polymath, did a lot of work hundreds of years ago, basically arguing that perception cannot be this direct readout of the world because the relation is so indirect, and things seem to obey regularities that can't be explained purely in terms of the sensory data. Like when you take a piece of white paper from inside a room to outside a room, it still seems white. How does that happen? It's because the brain isn't just reading off the light that comes into the eyes. It's trying to figure out what's causing the light.
Just to double click on that. So if you're under, let's say, fluorescent lights, and then you walk under the sunlight, what's actually bouncing off the paper and hitting your eyes is a different wavelength. And yet we see it as white, and both this is color constancy.
The brain is always after utility.
Yeah.
We perceive the world in a way that evolution has decided is useful for us. The novelist Anil Seth put it beautifully when she said, we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. That's what the brain is gunning for. And then there's this trade-off between the brain's prior expectations or beliefs about what's going on and how much the brain decides to update its beliefs, expectations, predictions with new sensory data. Sometimes it can update quite quickly, pay a lot of attention to this data. Sometimes it can pay less attention. In fact, attention is exactly that process, in my mind anyway. Attention is exactly the process of balancing how much incoming sensory information is able to update the brain's best guess, controlled hallucination of what's actually happening.
Right. So people like Kant and Helmholtz and others, all the way back to Plato, as you point out, have thought about, hey, maybe we're not seeing reality as it is, but we're seeing something that we are having to construct from the inside because the brain is isolated. So then by the 1960s, the neuroscientist Donald McKay noticed something. I don't know if other people had noticed this before, but he noticed that the amount of input to the visual cortex at the back of the brain that's coming from the eyes is actually really small. I think the estimates now are that it's 5% of the input to the visual cortex comes from the eyeballs, and all the rest is this sort of feedback. So let's come back to this issue, how you think about this with predictions and what the brain is doing.
That's a great place to start because that's such a paradox, isn't it? I mean, when I was starting out, and I think you and I started in neuroscience around the same time, and the textbooks I remember reading just described perception as this bottom-up, inside-out process. Signals would come into the retina, early parts of the visual cortex right at the back of the brain would fish out really simple features like lines and edges, and then you got this picture of information marching deeper and deeper into the brain, sort of more complex things being fished out. And then somehow the brain put all these pieces back together, and that led to this experience of a world. If you open a textbook now, you will probably see something quite similar. I think this has been a very, very pervasive idea, despite this long and rich history from Plato to Kant to Helmholtz and so on.
And 60-something years since McKay published his papers.
60 years since McKay's observation, which is hard to understand in this classical view, right? If perception is done in this bottom-up direction, why do you have so many connections going the other way from the brain back out to the senses? It doesn't make any sense. But from the perspective of perception as this constructive process, it makes much more sense. So digging into it a bit more, so far, we've kind of outlined that the brain has to make this inference about what's out there on the basis of noisy and ambiguous sensory signals without labels. Now, in mathematics, we call this Bayesian inference. It's a process of reasoning under conditions of uncertainty, or in general, how you should update what you believe when you get new data. And this is a very, very general formulation. The Reverend Thomas Bayes and Laplace figured out the maths hundreds of years ago. And it's been used to do all kinds of things, like figure out where to look for missing nuclear submarines, or even figure out how likely you are to have a disease if you've got particular symptoms. It's always when things are uncertain that this mathematics is useful. It's the same deal with perception. The brain is trying to figure out what it should believe now about what's out there, given some new information from the senses. Now, the problem is that actually doing Bayesian inference is really, really hard. In fact, it's almost impossible to do it exactly. So the brain, like any good biological evolutionary hack, has figured out an approximation, a very general approximation. And this approximation is, in the business, we call it predictive coding or predictive processing. And what this means is that the brain effectively has some kind of model of the world and the body, and it uses that model to generate predictions about the sensory information that should be coming in. And these predictions, they cascade in this top-down direction and back out to the sensory surfaces through all these connections that Mackay identified. And then the sensory signals, instead of being read out by the brain, they just serve as prediction errors. They report the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets. At every level, from the retina to the early parts of the visual cortex, all the way up. And if the brain then follows a very, very simple rule, which is just either make an action or update its prediction to try and minimize these prediction errors. So it's just trying to minimize and trying to reduce these prediction error sensory signals. Then collectively, its predictions will be a very, very, very good approximation to Bayesian inference. So we get a picture in which the brain is constantly casting out predictions into the world. The sensory signals update these predictions, and there's always this simple mechanism which the brain is just trying to minimize prediction error. And as a result, what happens is the brain is able to make a best guess about what's out there in the world or in the body. And then the claim is, well, that's what we perceive.
So let me just summarize. So the idea is the brain can't know exactly what's out there, so it's making its best guesses and then saying, oh, wow, that guess was really off. That guess was a little closer, and so on. And as it matches the incoming data, it gets to refine its model that way until it has a reasonably good model. And so one of the ideas that's been floating around in neuroscience for a while, but again, I don't think this makes it to the textbooks, is this idea that all of the data that we see in the sensory cortices is actually the error. It's the part that you didn't get right. And if you were actually getting everything 100% right, you'd have, golden silence going on in there. But the world is complicated and things are always happening not in a way you can predict away. But this is the frame shift that's required to see this sort of thing. So coming back to why you call this a controlled hallucination, let's do it this way, which is we don't need our eyes at all to have rich visual experience, right? You have dreams at night when your eyes are closed, right? And so the idea is that maybe you are dreaming, you're producing all the stuff on the inside, but you use the word controlled to indicate, look, you're anchored to what's going on the outside. You've got this, let's say 5% of data coming in from the sensory world, and that anchors you somewhat, and that's what you mean by controlled hallucination, controlled dreaming in a sense.
That's exactly right. In fact, if you describe perception as a kind of controlled hallucination, then you can just flip it around and you can say when you're hallucinating as we would normally use it, when someone sees something that's not there, or indeed when they're dreaming, well, you can just call that uncontrolled perception. And I think the point here is that there's a continuity. They're not completely different categories. So, we're used to thinking of dreams and hallucinations as coming more from the inside than the outside. And it's true that in normal perception, the outside world plays a bigger role. But fundamentally, I think it's the same kind of process. It's the same dance, this exchange of prediction and prediction error, but you change exactly how this dance plays out, and you can sort of sweep through all these different ways of experiencing, whether it's normal perception or dreaming or hallucination or something else.
Now, you use the terms controlled and uncontrolled, but in fact, it's more of a spectrum, I'd imagine, right? Where a controlled hallucination is, I'm looking for something on my desk, I have to really pay attention, and so in that sense, it's really controlled by what's in the outside world here. It's more controlled, whereas other times, it's less and less controlled when I'm, imagining something or just seeing whatever. And you can imagine in cases like Charles Bonnet syndrome, as people are going blind, they have formed visual hallucinations. They think they see somebody walking in or doing a bunch of dancers in the street or something, even though that's not there. So it's sort of like a spectrum of how much control the outside world has.
That's exactly right. And in fact, one of the powers of this approach is that you can use it to better understand what's going on in conditions like Charles Bonnet, where people have hallucinations. One of the things we did in my research group last year was we built computational models of this process of prediction and prediction error and so on. And we tweaked the model in different ways to try and simulate different kinds of hallucination. So Charles Bonnet syndrome, where indeed people often see patterns, but also people wandering around. Then there's in Parkinson's disease, people often have quite rich and complex hallucinations. And then in psychedelics, you get all kinds of different hallucinations too, that sometimes seem to emerge out of things that are already there in the environment. Like clouds can become animals or people, things like that. So we've been able to use this approach to really drill down and understand not only how these hallucinations happen, but how they and why they differ from each other. And what we did was we actually went to people who have these kinds of hallucinations in real life, and we asked them to judge the output of the model so that we could test whether our computational model of these hallucinations was right. Would somebody with Parkinson's disease pick the output that we generated when we were trying to simulate Parkinson's hallucinations? And more or less that worked well. So we're beginning to be able to really characterize, the level of what the brain is doing, these different kinds of hallucinations.
One of the things that I talked about in my book Incognito was this possibility that all of us might be having hallucinations all the time, but we don't know it. So for example, there's something on my desk here or I think my dog's over there when he's not and so on. And we only notice it when there's a clear indication that it's not true, either because someone else tells us, or I go look for my dog and realize that was a bag on the floor and not my dog, or so on. But probably this is happening all the time. I want to drill in on what you said about how you go out to different people with psychedelics or with Parkinson's disease and ask them and find out the degree to which this matches. What you're doing is taking things like, for example, in your TED Talk a while ago, you used Google Deep Dream to take footage, and Google Deep Dream sort of has these psychedelic hallucinations where it sees dogs' faces and everything. So tell us about that.
That's exactly right. I think it's a nice story because we basically did that to start with just because it was a lot of fun. We had this virtual reality lab. One of my postdocs is very good at coding these things up. And we just thought, why can't we try and make a situation where, at the time people had been just taking photos of bowls of pasta and then putting them through Google Deep Dream, and they'd all become, they'd grow, loads of puppy heads would be there in the bowl of pasta. And we just thought, should we just try and do this in virtual reality? Just because. And so we took a panoramic movie, so 360-degree movie, and we put every frame through an adaptation of this deep dream algorithm so that you would get frame-to-frame continuity. So it was not an easy thing to do.
Can I interrupt for just 1 second? Just so everyone's clear. The reason Google Deep Dream sees puppy faces everywhere is because that's its expectation. Its Bayesian prior is that it's looking for puppy faces. And so that's why it sees it everywhere. If you even vaguely have like 2 dots and a line or something, it says, oh, there's a puppy face. Okay, keep going.
That's exactly right. And of course, it doesn't have to be puppies. You could give the network another expectation. You basically fix another node or part of the network, and then it's expecting something else. And that's actually the key. So once we'd done this with Sussex Campus, and we did it with the dog expectation, so suddenly people would have all these strange experiences of Sussex University campus, all these dogs coming out of the walls and the windows and the sky. And we tried it, and it was fun. And it just struck us when we were thinking about this, would there be any actual scientific utility in it? And what we realized was that in a lot of psychology experiments, people focus for good reasons on very constrained situations. They ask people, was the dot moving to the left or the right, or was the patch of light there or not there, or something very, very simple, so that you can make very precise measurements. But these things are very far from the richness of everyday conscious experience. And in the end, that's what we want to understand. So what we realized was what we built was not a model of any kind of cognition, of what people think, or any kind of behavior, what they do. What we built was a model of experience. We built a model of a particular way of encountering the world. And not many people have really been doing that. In fact, it was probably one of the first examples of doing something like this, and it was really just for fun. So from that starting point, then your point is exactly right. So that initial network was set up to project expectations of dogs into everything. But so what we then did was we moved on from the Google Deep Dream algorithm to some more complicated neural network architecture that we could tweak in different ways, so that we could begin to simulate different kinds of hallucinations. So some hallucinations are very rich and very complex. Others are very simple and very geometric. Some hallucinations appear out of nowhere. They just spontaneously arise. Other hallucinations are transformations of things that are already there. So we were able to kind of create this space we could move around in to generate these different kinds of experience.
So tell us what you learned from that.
So what we were able to do, this is with my colleagues, David Schwartzman and Kesuke Suzuki. They did all this work, by the way. I want to make that very clear. We went to people who have these hallucinations in real life, people with Parkinson's disease, people with another condition you mentioned, Charles-Bonnet syndrome, people who've had psychedelic experiences, not that we're having them then and there, but have had them. And we asked them to pick examples from our models that were most similar to the experiences that they had. And that way we can test our hypotheses about the computational basis of these different kinds of hallucinations. So eventually, and we're not there yet, but eventually the idea is by doing this, we'll be able to make some predictions about what we might see if we put these people in brain imaging scanners and imaged what's happening while they have their hallucinations. That's the next step. And overall, the goal is, I think, to put it in this larger frame. When you want to understand something like how we experience the world, the nature of perception, it's often a very good idea to look at those situations where things are a little bit strange, where people are experiencing things differently. You poke around in it and see what happens when things are a little bit out of whack. So the utility of studying hallucinations for me is firstly for the people that have them. We can help them understand their lived experience better. But it also reflects back on our understanding of perception in general, because, as we've been saying, fundamentally it's the same process.
Yes. Now, let me drill in on this for a minute, because you and I are both fascinated by individual differences in the reality inside different heads. And I've made many episodes on this topic, for example, the spectrum from aphantasia to hyperphantasia, or the internal voice, or what happens with synesthesia of different types. All these sorts of things indicate that we're experiencing different realities in ways that we can study. You, with your colleague Fiona McPherson, you launched the Perception Census. Tell us about that and tell us what you've learned.
Oh, thank you for asking this. I mean, I'm glad we're talking about this because I think it is probably one of our strongest overlaps. And I have to say, a lot of my interest in this area was inspired by conversations with you dating back scarily, I think, well over 20 years now when we first started talking about these things. But certainly the work in synesthesia, individual differences, it falls out as a consequence of this way of thinking. And I think this is worth saying first. If we start with the textbook view of visual perception, it's kind of easy to think that we will all see the world, hear the world in roughly the same way. And that's also how perceptual experience feels. Like it feels like I just see the world as it is. It doesn't seem to me as though it depends all that much on my brain, or certainly not on the specifics of my brain compared to yours. But how it seems is never a particularly good guide to how things are. And in this view of perception as this prediction, this controlled hallucination, this generative process, then it's going to be different for each and every one of us. You know, we all differ on the outside in skin color and height and body shape, and we all have slightly different brains too. And so we should all experience the world to some extent differently. But the key difference here is it's easy to tell whether people are different heights, even if the difference is quite small. You know, I can just look at two people standing next to each other and I'll see if one's taller than the other. But if you experience red slightly differently from me, or time slightly differently from me, how will we ever know? Because your experience is private, subjective to you. We'll probably use the same words. You know, it's red. That lasted about a second. It's so much harder to tell. And so we end up assuming, I think, overestimating the similarity of our inner worlds. And so this project of the Perception Census with Fiona McPherson and many other colleagues, Rennie Bykova, a postdoc who really drove it here at Sussex, we wanted to study these individual differences, but we wanted to do it at scale. So this is not a new idea. David, you've done a lot of this work, contributed a lot to this literature already. But many of these studies focus on one or two or three aspects of perception, maybe synesthesia, which I'm sure your listeners all know about because you wrote a book on this, literally, several books. But, you know, or maybe something else like time or ability to discriminate different musical notes. We wanted to look at lots of things together, and we wanted to look at a lot of people and people from many places and of many ages. So we got quite ambitious. We put together over 50 different tasks rather than just 2 or 3. 50 different experiments that people could do, lots of visual illusions, sound. Had to be things people could do at home. So we couldn't do things like smell or whatever. But 50 different things. And overall, we were able to get around 40,000 people engaged in the census, from ages of 18 to well over 70, and from 127 different countries.
Wow. So
it's been a huge data gathering effort. And I really see this as a resource, and I hope it's going to be an important resource for, you know, the whole community, because we're going to make the data entirely open. And it can be a bit of a sandpit for testing ideas or hypotheses that people might have. You might want to ask, does somebody with more vivid mental imagery, you know, do they see more different shades of color? You know, what things tend to go together? And as part of the census, we also have some data on people, where they reside on some of the more clinical dimensions too, autism, ADHD, things like that. So we can start to understand how these conditions relate to the normal spectrum of variability. So I've been using the term here, perceptual diversity, rather than what many people have heard, neurodiversity. And I want to just dwell on that for a second, because this idea of neurodiversity has been very important, and it's led to a lot of recognition that people with conditions like autism is the one that's most commonly used here, but there's others as well, ADHD, that they experience things differently, and that can cause some problems, can give some benefits, but it's different. But ironically, in my mind, the idea of neurodiversity has kind of reinforced the idea that if you're not neurodivergent in some way, then you're neurotypical and you see the world as it is. And it's underplayed, I think, the reality, or certainly the reality we're exploring with the census, let's see if it's true, that there's just variation. And maybe when you get somewhere towards the extreme of a distribution, a label is slapped on it and it becomes a neurodivergent condition. But I think that if we all understood that each of us experiences the world in our own unique individual way, this is not at all to diminish or minimize neurodivergent conditions. I just want to understand them as part of a spectrum in which there's variation among all of us, just as there is in height, body shape, anything else. That's what the perception census is empirically trying to look at, because we just don't have this data yet. How much variation is out there? What does it look like? How does it correlate?
By the way, just for fun, I'll tell you about my idiothesis. Idiothesis is the term we use in my lab for an idiotic hypothesis, but it's what I've been interested in is, as you know, I'm a lover of literature, and I've noticed that authors like Ernest Hemingway and, let's say, Thomas Hardy have very different ways of writing. And I think this is I'm generally calling this retrospective brain scanning, because I think we can tell that Hemingway was probably aphantasic, meaning he didn't picture details in his head and didn't care about them. But somebody like Thomas Hardy or, Fenimore Cooper or anybody like that put so many details on the page, and the red curtains billowed and the flowers were these flowers in this arrangement and so on. And I happen to be on the aphantasic end of things. And so I can't stand those authors who give tons and tons of detail that don't matter. Now, the reason this is an idiothesis is because I can't ever prove this is true. And there may be other reasons why they wrote in the styles they did. But I like the idea that this is yet another correlation in the world, is by looking at people's outputs, the way they talk, the way they describe the world. And that might give us some even very rough insight about what's happening internally.
I think that there's something to that. I think one thing that's well known, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that some authors were clearly synesthetic. So I think Vladimir Nabokov was well known as a synesthete. And that's interesting, not only for the perspective of how he might have described the world around him, whether it was detailed, but whether it affected other things, whether there was sort of just more cross-fertilization, more associativity in the way he was writing compared to other people. Because synesthesia, which again is something that, you actually did, I think it was the first large-scale survey of synesthesia in the Synesthesia battery. So we're looking at synesthesia again, but of course, in the same group of people, we're looking at all kinds of other things too. So I'm really excited to see what synesthesia is associated with. Unfortunately, we didn't ask people whether they'd written any great works of literature.
The truth is, I've always struggled with this question about whether synesthesia is associated with higher creativity, because in a sense, it's not creative. If I always see M as purple and B as orange and so on, that's not particularly creative. It's just an association that I have. In the case of Vladimir Nabokov, there are little clues that we have everywhere. Just as one example, he was a lepidopterist, which means he studied butterflies, and for him, his favorite butterfly had a particular pattern of yellow, black, yellow, and so his novel Ada happens to map onto those colors of those letters where. A is yellow and D is black and A is yellow. So we see little clues like that, but I don't know if it makes a person more creative or not.
Yeah, there's another example of that. I actually ended up writing a piece for a gallery catalog about an artist, Yayoi Kusama. She's still alive. She's in her 90s in Japan. And she's very, very well known for these artworks that have things like red polka dots everywhere, and there's these sort of patterns over everything, representations of landscapes and so on. And it's a very distinctive style. She also does these mirror infinity rooms. But it seems that she has this way of experiencing the world in which she literally does see red dots everywhere at some times. I forget the technical name for it, but there's a sort of perceptual condition where this happens. And so exactly to your point, maybe her artistic innovation was to some extent a direct transcription of what she was just seeing. Now, I think that is not the full story. I think it provides the raw materials that people can use to generate pieces of art, whether they're paintings, music, novels that have a creative and artistic impact. So I don't think it reduces, but I also agree with you that this association, we have to be careful, because if it's automatic and normal, where is the creativity? The creativity is in what you do with it. It's not the thing itself.
That's right. And by the way, Kandinsky, the visual painter, he had a very rich synesthesia that was triggered by sound. And so what he would do is crank up his phonograph and stand in front of the canvas and paint what he was seeing. And what's interesting about that's an example where he's just transcribing what his perception is. But what's interesting is, given that we all have different internal worlds, it's nice to find ways to share like that. And I do think in, let's say, literature and novels, you are getting to step into the shoes of someone who sees the world differently than you do. And that's why we love to share stories with one another.
Yeah, I think again, something you and I no doubt agree on is that, when we face the challenge of understanding consciousness, in the sort of most expansive way, we want to understand what it is like to be me or to be you. And sure, we can study visual perception or auditory perception or something like that. But for a lot of people, the experience of being who they are is tied up with the self. It's tied up with some kind of internal narrative, distinctive way of being in the world. And literature has done, I think, more than science to explore, examine that aspect of consciousness.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was going to ask you about this. So in your book, Being You, you talked about the way that we build a model of the outside world by minimizing the prediction errors, but also we build models of the inside world. So tell us about that.
So this is another inversion, if you like, a conceptual upside down move. We've already had one, which is the idea that instead of experiencing the world in this kind of outside in direction where the world just pours into the mind, it's this act of construction, this controlled hallucination. Now, another common assumption, or a sort of, it might seem an obvious way of thinking about things, is when we think about the self. And it might seem just intuitive to say that the self, what it is to be me, well, that's the thing that does the perceiving. There's some essence of me inside my skull that is the recipient of all these perceptions, however they're constructed, that takes them in, figures out what to do next, does something, and we sense, we think, we act, and go round and round and round. Now, I think this is not the way to think about things. I think it's very different. Rather than the self being that which does the perceiving, I think it's more correct to say that the self itself is a kind of perception. So there's just a same process going on. The brain is making inferences about sensory signals from different places and over different time scales. Some of those inferences underlie our experiences of the world, and some of those inferences, some of those controlled hallucinations, are what the self actually is. The self is this collection of perceptions that have, and I think this is the key, why is the self different from the world? What's special about the self? Well, one of the things that's special about the self is the body. So perceptions of self, for me anyway, are rooted in the brain's perception, predictions about the body. And all our aspects of self are built on that.
Great. So your brain is monitoring the outside world and it's monitoring the inside world, inside the body. And you've made the argument that it not only tries to predict, but eventually becomes good at saying, okay, look, this is my model, is that, let's say, the body temperature should be at this. So if it fluctuates, this is what gives you the ability to do homeostasis, to keep things in order, because you have a well-established model at this point.
That's absolutely right. And I know you recently had Lisa Feldman Barrett on the podcast, and she and I have a pretty similar view about this, but I think we came to it from very different directions. I mean, Lisa's always been interested specifically in emotion and pushing back against these Darwinian ideas of hard-coded emotion circuits in the brain. I came to these kinds of ideas by just thinking about, well, how does the brain perceive the outside world? And well, maybe there's something similar happening about emotion, building actually on some very early ideas of William James and Carl Langer, who talked about emotion as a process of the brain's appraisal or interpretation of the physiological condition of the body. But where we end up is somewhere, it's not exactly the same. There are differences between how Lisa and I see things. But where we end up is one fundamental realization about what brains are for that really, I think, casts everything we think about perception consciousness in a different light. And this is that brains are not for creating art or writing poetry or doing complex math or even having conversations. If you think about what the primary duty of any brain is, it's to keep the body and itself alive. If you don't do that, you don't do anything. And to keep an organism alive is a difficult thing. I mean, that's why evolution has shaped all these weird and wonderful creatures. But it usually, well, in fact, it always requires keeping certain physiological variables like heart rate, blood pressure, blood oxygenation within very tight ranges. You've got to regulate your physiology. If your blood oxygen drops, you won't last very long if it drops too much. And so how does the brain do this? Well, any control engineer will tell you that a good way to regulate something, to keep it where it needs to be, is to have a predictive model about it. Because if you have a predictive model, you can anticipate deviations. When we both finish recording and we stand up, the brain is anticipating that our blood pressure will drop a bit. So it transiently increases the blood pressure. It constricts our vessels. So our blood pressure, in fact, remains pretty much exactly the same. We don't faint. So the ability to control and regulate is done best through prediction. And so for me, that's the fundamental reason why brains work this way, why perception works this way. It's all built on this fundamental imperative of the brain to regulate homeostatically, allostatically, the physiology of the body. And I think the way I like to put it in my book is we experience the world and the self with, through, and because of our living bodies.
And so unpack that just a little bit more.
So there's, this whole question of what emotions are, how they come about, what they're for is super, super interesting. But they kind of polarize to two extremes. On one extreme, you have Darwin, or at least a kind of caricature of Darwin, which says that there's a certain repertoire of emotions, happiness, anger, sadness, disgust, things like this. They're pretty much hardwired into our brains. They're kind of different from cognition, from thinking. They're more physiological, like survival reflexes that feel particular ways. And they're pretty fixed and conserved. The idea is across time and across cultures. And this has been kind of the mainstream view, I think, in one way or another for a long time. And then on the other hand, you've got the idea of emotions as being somewhat constructed. Now, this has also got a long history. William James, we mentioned a minute ago, he realized over 100 years ago that emotions were very, very deeply embodied. That he proposed the idea that if, say, a bear comes charging into the room, we will feel afraid and then we might run away. And it might be normal to think that it's the sight of the bear that causes the feeling of fear, and then the feeling of the fear causes me to run away. And James is becoming a common theme to our conversation now, flips this around, right? So for William James and also Carl Langer, the bear comes charging into the room. My brain registers the presence of the bear. This puts my body into a particular physiological state, and adrenaline shoots up, cortisol starts racing around. And then my brain perceives this change happening in the body in the context of a bear being there. And that is the emotion of fear. So fear in this case follows, or is at least part of, the change in the body. It's not that fear then causes the change in the body. The experience of fear is the perception of what's happening in the body in this context of something dangerous happening. So that's the way I think about it. I've come to think about emotion as grounded in this imperative for regulation, and just as with the perception census, there will be variation, but there'll be also a lot of similarity. There's a lot of similarities in the way we see things. So, I tend to always land in this sort of happy or unhappy medium where there may be some amount of biological conservation going on. There's sort of good reasons for that. But there might also be more variation than we might think.
Given the way that you're thinking about consciousness, what do you think about other animals having consciousness? And what's your take on AI becoming conscious?
Two super important and increasingly timely questions. I mean, there's so much excitement, hype, and some amount of anxiety and fear about AI, and things are changing. Animals, of course, have been around for a very long time. And we've had over history varying views about their status as conscious creatures or not. And I think they pose as very different challenges. So we humans, we tend to see the world through the lens of being human. We're very anthropocentric. And not only that, we're very anthropomorphic. We tend to project human-like things into other systems on the basis of what might be superficial similarities. So this is to say that when it comes to other animals, if they're different from us, we tend to withhold from them things that we think are distinctively human or matter to our humanity, like intelligence and consciousness. And I think it's this combination of biases that can get us into trouble here. Because we see things through a human lens, we've tended over history to associate something like consciousness with other things that we think of as distinctively human, like intelligence and language. So if we do that, and we look at non-human animals, we tend to reserve consciousness for those animals that seem the smartest. And in fact, we've done worse than that. It wasn't that long ago that people didn't give babies anesthesia. I mean, this seems crazy now, but it was not common practice until a few decades ago. It was this sort of assumption was they don't really feel pain. And I think that just shows how deeply our assumptions like this can affect our practice. And we have exactly the opposite situation now with artificial intelligence. So AI systems like ChatGPT or Claude can speak to us fluently. Whether it counts as conversations, I'm much less sure. I mean, Sherry Turkle has talked about this beautifully and said, when we converse with a machine, we unthinkably simplify what we mean by a conversation. It's a different form of human-machine interaction. But because words are being exchanged and some of the things that language models can say really are quite surprisingly articulate and informative, we tend to project qualities like consciousness into these machines. Because if it was a human being talking to us like that, well, that human being would clearly be conscious. But it's not. It's something very, very, very different. So I think the first thing we have to do is recognize how much our intuitions about the circle of consciousness, how far these intuitions are shaped by our biases, and that we can't just crawl out from under them. We can't get away from them. These biases might be what we might call cognitively impenetrable, like some visual illusions. There are some illusions that even when you know two lines are the same length, they will always look different. This is the Muller-Lyer illusion. So even if we know we're biased in these anthropocentric ways, we will still be unable to resist these intuitions. So we need to just surface that and then ask the question, so what's actually most likely the case? And here I think there's extremely good reason to believe that consciousness is pretty widespread in non-human animals. If you look through all mammals, whether it's a tree shrew or a orangutan, they have the same basic neural architecture that we know is important in human beings for consciousness. I think things get really tricky when we look at birds, when we look at fish, when we look at insects. And here I just think we can't be determinate. We don't know one way or the other, but we just need to keep updating our credence in consciousness in these things. And I think the key thing is we also have to ask, well, what kind of consciousness matters? It may well be the case that not many non-human animals have fully developed reflective experiences of being particular individuals. I mean, we don't know yet, but it seems unlikely. But ethically, what matters is whether they have the capacity to suffer, to feel pain. This is a very utilitarian perspective, but I think it's a sensible one. So I think we underestimate probably the extent of animal consciousness, and I think we overestimate the likelihood of AI being conscious. And there are many reasons why I'm very skeptical of this, but fundamentally, my great basis for the skepticism is I think we've just overused the metaphor of the brain as a computer. It's a beautiful, brilliant, powerful metaphor, but it's a metaphor. We've always used the dominant technology of the day as a metaphor for the brain. And we always get into trouble, or we usually get into trouble, when we start confusing a metaphor with the thing itself.
What do you see as the biggest unanswered question in consciousness research, and what excites you the most about where the field is headed?
Oh, wow. I mean, the biggest unanswered question is it's still the old question. How does it happen? We still don't really know, I don't think. I mean, there's progress, and to be honest, and I don't know, I'd be interested if you feel the same way that I do, David. We've been doing this more or less for the same amount of time, long time now, decades. Some days I feel like, it's still a complete mystery. We have neurons, chemicals, electrical signals, but why do I experience anything? Why is there experience in the world, in the universe at all? Those days, I'll have a cup of coffee and get on with things. But then on other days, I think back to where we were in when I started studying in the early 1990s, consciousness wasn't even on the menu if you wanted to look at psychology, neuroscience. It was ostracized completely. I mean, we met because I came to San Diego in the early 2000s, which was at the time one of the only places where you could study consciousness legitimately with the approval of a PI in a lab, and it was still a pretty rare thing to do. And so looking back through that lens and looking at the theories that we now have and the kinds of experiments that have been done and how we've learned more about different kinds of consciousness, I then worry less that this big metaphysical existential question is still waiting in the wings. And so I think that here's maybe the way to put it. I haven't thought about it in quite this way before, but maybe the biggest unanswered question in consciousness research is whether there will turn out to be a big unanswered question in consciousness research or not. In other words, as we just understand more and more about different kinds of experience, what happens in anesthesia, maybe the question of consciousness will turn out to be a little bit like the question of life. 150 years ago, many people thought that life was something beyond the reach of science, that there had to be something supernatural, some élan vital, some spark of life to explain the difference between the living and the non-living. And of course, we don't think that anymore. I mean, life is still not a completely written book. We don't understand everything, but there's no conceptual mystery that life is part of nature, and even its origin seems increasingly within reach to explain and understand. And what happened there wasn't that anybody proved that life didn't exist or found the spark of life in some eureka moment. No, biologists started just to make progress explaining this property of living systems, homeostasis, this property, reproduction, this property, metabolism. And little by little, we learnt about the nature of life, and we stopped worrying that there was something fundamentally inexplicable about it. And progress in science is often like this. Sometimes it's not only the answers that change, but it's the questions that change too. So that's what I've got my own. That's what gives me hope. I think we understand more when the questions we ask start to look different.
I totally agree with you. And what's been interesting for me is I also feel the way you do many mornings where I think, gosh, when you and I were in San Diego in the early 2000s, the questions that were being asked were mostly the same, but things have changed slowly. And just as one example, at that time, all neuroscientists were sort of snarky about artificial intelligence because they felt like, okay, we've been at this for a long time. It's not really happening. There were artificial neural networks with the same principles that we have now, but it seemed like it's never going to happen. And now we look at ChatGPT every day and do experiments on it, and we find, wow, it's actually working in a way. Now, who knows if it's conscious? I think we share the view that it's probably not conscious, but boy, is it impressive. And so because of improvements in our technology, in our ability to measure things in biology, in just data gathering and ways of doing things bigger and better, we find different views now than we did a quarter century ago.
I think that's right. By the way, I have to, just one other aspect to the whole AI thing that I think is really useful to think about. So there's this whole debate about whether ChatGPT or language models might be conscious. People ask the question, right? And some people think that they are. But just yesterday, I was lucky enough to visit DeepMind in London. And that's where AlphaFold was developed, which is another AI system that's able to predict protein structure from amino acid sequences. The protein folding problem has been one of the biggest challenges in biology for a long time. AlphaFold basically sorts that out. Now, isn't it interesting that no one thinks that AlphaFold is conscious? I've not heard anybody suggest to me that AlphaFold might have experience. Yet, there's some differences, but they're very, very similar. The architectures, they're made out of they're computer algorithms, they're neural network based with some other stuff that they even have transformer architectures. They're really not that different. Yet our intuitions about the two are so different. I think that really, to me, highlights how much of what we think is driven by our psychological bias. I think the other thing is that, there can be this interesting non-linearity here, right? AI seemed to flatline for a long time. And there's this sudden rush of discovery and invention and increase in competence. Maybe this is going to happen in the neuroscience of consciousness too. And there are some super exciting developments, over where in your part of the world, in Stanford, there's so much exciting work going on in optogenetics and in synthetic biology, people developing brain organoids, these collections of brain cells in dishes that are derived from human embryonic stem cells. Things that really, as I think you said, they give us different perspectives, different views, different tools. And science often needs that. You can have ideas, you can have theories, but a lot of advance historically in science is when people obtain, invent new tools. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in neuroscience now. So I am actually pretty optimistic for the future.
That was my interview with Anil Seth, professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at Sussex and the author of Being You. We explored here how our brains create our reality, from controlled hallucinations to the rich diversity of individual perceptions. What I want to leave you with is an idea that you've heard me talk about many times before on this podcast, which is that consciousness is not just about directly experiencing the world, but instead it's about actively constructing it. While consciousness remains one of the central mysteries in neuroscience, today's conversation, I hope, gives us a lens through which to view it, not as something mystical or otherworldly, but as a grounded biological phenomenon rooted in the brain's continuous dance of sensory input and its own predictions. Now, thinking about our perception of the world, not as a direct reflection of reality, but a construction of the brain, the inner world meeting the outer world, this is really the single reasonable way to understand it. And in a sense, it's a little strange that this is still rare in textbooks or in common knowledge. And note that this process of trying to predict signals applies not just to our perception of the outside world, but to the swirling world inside our bodies as well, which sheds light on how we experience emotions and maintain homeostasis. In this way, the self is not a fixed entity, but an ever-changing construct. And one of the other themes that emerged today is that each of us carries around a slightly different version of reality shaped by our biology and our experiences. This is a reminder of how subjective and varied human experience can be, and how much we still have to learn about the minds of others. That includes other humans and animals, and possibly at some point, AI. Are we overestimating the sentience of machines or underestimating that of animals? So in closing, as Anil mentioned, just as we once demystified life itself step by step through the patient work of science, we may one day come to understand consciousness in a similar manner. The key, as it is so often in science, is not just about answering the big question, but continually asking smaller, better ones. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion. And check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.